Okay, so this week's parsha is Massey, and Massey is a double portion, a very, very big portion. In addition to that is it's also a period of time known as the 3 weeks, meaning to say we're between the period of Shiva Asar Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, and it's the period of national mourning, communal mourning for the temple, and also all the tragedies that have happened to the Jewish people over the centuries. So therefore, I'd like to talk about the relationship, first of all, with the 3 weeks. Second of all, talk a little bit about the parsha and also the connection to the Daf Yomi, because today's Daf Yomi is right on point about the 3 weeks. It is the passage of the story of the destruction of the temple. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that this is the 3 weeks. And the 3 weeks is known as the Bein Hamtzarim, between the straits. This is the period of time where the Jewish people are supposed to be in a communal mourning. Ashkenazic Jews are generally stricter than the Sephardic Jews in this area. That Ashkenazic Jews from Rosh Chodesh, first of all, from Shiva Asar Tammuz, the strong custom is not to get married from the 3 weeks until Tisha B'Av. Although Chacham Ovadia Yosef says that if there are extenuating circumstances and there's a great loss of money, you could get married in the 3 weeks. Also, it's a strong practice not to recite the Shechianu bracha, not to make a blessing over a new fruit or new clothing, or perhaps on Shabbos. Some are lenient on Shabbos, but generally speaking, should not eat a new fruit or wear new clothing during this period. And then once the Rosh Chodesh comes along, the general practice to be even stricter, that you no longer bathe for pleasure, you just shower to remove the sweat that's on your body. And there's a custom not to eat meat or drink wine during the 9 days except on Shabbos. So before we get into the parsha and also talk about some of the 3 weeks and 9 days, I wanted to just tell you one story about the 3 weeks and the 9 days. This is a story as follows. It's told about the Saba Kadisha of Radishitz, meaning to say, this is the story that there's a strong practice not to eat meat or drink wine during the 9 days. But what about if you make a siyum, if you finish a tractate? So about this, normally if somebody when they typically make a siyum, they typically have a party. They throw a party where they serve meat and wine. And then the custom is that during the 9 days, you'd be allowed to do that, even if you don't typically eat meat or drink wine. However, Chacham Ovadia Yosef says you're not supposed to arrange your schedule so that you finish a tractate specifically during the 9 days in order to have this celebration. That would be disingenuous against the spirit of the law. So, but it was the custom of Rabbi Yisachar Ber of Radishitz that he always completed the study of Masechta, and he had a big party with meat and wine every year on the 5th of Av. He made a huge party every year on the 5th of Av, because that date is the anniversary of the passing of the Arizal. That date's the anniversary of the passing of the Arizal. And so every year in the middle of the 9 days, the Saba Kadisha of Radashitz would tell the following story. On the 5th of Av, when he would make a siyum, he would finish a tractate, he would tell the following story. The story was as follows: that there was a small town in Galicia, that there was a man who was a huge sleeper. He used to sleep all the time, and he was nicknamed the Sleeper. That was his nickname. Can you imagine going through life and your nickname is the Sleeper? Reminds me of a line in today's Daf Yomi, I'll tell you in a moment. So this man was the Sleeper. And the month of Elul arrived in all of its awe that year. So once everybody felt, because right after the Av, after Tisha B'Av, we look forward to Rosh Chodesh, we can't wait for it to come. Everybody gets all excited. Elul means Rosh Hashanah is coming. Everybody's so happy. Yom Kippur, Sukkot. But this man who was the Sleeper, unlike everybody else who was trembling with fear and awe and delight, this man was sleeping. And it was Rosh Hashanah. His wife got up early. She went to daven. This man was sleeping. Then, in the middle of davening, she goes home to nurse her baby. Her husband's still sleeping. She tries to wake him up, but the Sleeper didn't move. She comes back several times throughout the davening to try to wake him. The Sleeper doesn't move. He's not moving. He's the Sleeper. So, meanwhile, the congregation started reading the Torah. So the time of Rosh Hashanah, the time of the shofar blowing was coming closer and closer and closer. She ran home and she shouted at the top of her lungs, "They're about to blow the shofar." So this man, the Sleeper, jumped out of bed, such a hurry. He grabbed his garments, which were torn, and threw it over his shoulders, ran to the shul, burst inside, saying, "Where's the shofar? I got to hear the shofar." It was comical. And everybody was davening. It wasn't like there were thousands of people. It was a small community. And they saw this, and some of the children even snickered, and some of the adults even snickered. This poor guy, this Sleeper, he was so embarrassed that in his burning shame, he ran up to the heavenly court, and at that moment, his shame came before, his embarrassment came before the heavenly court, and the court made a decree in heaven. Because this person became so embarrassed because he ran to serve Hashem, from that point on, all of his sins were forgiven. That's a story the Saba Kadisha would tell every year on the 5th of Av. So to us, said the Saba Kadisha, right now during this period, we're in the 3 weeks. We're in the depths of the destruction, mourning for the destruction of the base of Mikdash. We're sitting down to a festive meal. So why this is such a shameful thing, you would say, then on its account, meaning to say we're so ashamed that we're having this meal now, we should forgive the sins of the entire house of Israel. And it's a very strange story, but he was saying we're doing something to be embarrassed, and in the middle of our destruction, we have to have this celebration. And then he would cry so powerfully that his tears fell into the wine, and he would sing by the rivers of Babylon. These are the people, for them, the story of the destruction of the temple was not something that happened 2,000 years ago. It was something that happened right then, at that moment in front of them. It was something that they were reliving. I want to tell you just one more story before we turn to the portion and then tell a little bit more of the stories. But this is the story from the Talmud. The Talmud tells us that it's a classic story. But the story is that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he saw that the destruction of the temple was coming close, he saw he had no choice. And just to back up a little bit, the Talmud tells us in Gittin 56 that there was a siege of the Romans around Jerusalem. There were a group of people there who wanted to fight the Romans, and there were a group of people who wanted to try to make a peace arrangement with the Romans. That was the rabbis. The rabbis wanted to try to make some sort of compromise, whereas the people there, whereas these the zealots, they wanted to fight. So there was enough grain and food in the city to last for 21 years. There was three wealthy men. They were Kalba Sabua, Naktimon ben Gurion, and also the third one was one Ben Tzitzis Hakesses. These are the three wealthy men. They had enough food. One said, I'll provide the wheat. One said, I'll provide the fuel. One said, I'll provide the oil. And they had enough. So one said, I'll give the wheat and the barley. The other one says, I'll give the wine, the salt, and the oil. And the third one says, I'll give the fuel. I'll give the wood. They had enough supplies to last for 21 years. By the way, 21 years really means forever. Because why does it mean forever? Because it's 3 sabbatical year cycles. And so we're saying that we can provide, God will provide us for we have enough food to last 3 sabbatical year cycles. I mean, saying they could have lived forever with the Romans outside, but the zealots didn't want to live on the siege mentality, so they burnt all the crops. And then it was very clear that they were coming to a fight. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the one who said, I need to get out, at least make it's called a Hatzalah Porta, a little salvation. So since this is what he had to do, he needed to get out of Jerusalem. But his nephew was the head of the rebels, and the rebels were not letting anybody leave. So he called to his nephew. Abba Sikra. And he was the head of the zealots in Jerusalem. And he was the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's sister. So he said to him, come secretly to me so nobody knows you're coming to me. So he came and he said, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says to Abba Sikra, how long are you going to keep this up for? And we're all going to die by a famine. We can't live like this. So he says, well, what could I do? Abba Sikra says, I'm the head, but if I try to do anything, they'll kill me. So he says, tell me something that at least I can have a small, I can save a small group of people. So he says, okay, pretend you're sick. Tells Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, pretend you're sick. Put a smelly animal in your bed with you. Call everybody come by to you like you're dying. Then after you die, have the smelly animal there, so then you stink. And people think you're dead, and then we'll try carrying you out of the city, and he's able to smuggle him out of the city. So then Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is smuggled out of the city. I mean, it's a little bit more elaborate than that in the Talmud. And when he's smuggled out of the city, he comes to Vespasian. And so he comes to Vespasian. At that point, he comes to the Roman general at that time, who was Vespasian. And so he says to Vespasian, peace upon you, king. Peace upon you, king. He gives him this greeting. Peace upon you, king. Peace upon you, king. And Vespasian says, you're liable for death for 2 times. You're twice liable for death. 1, first of all, I'm not a king. And number 2, you've called me a king. And if I am a king, then why haven't you come until now? That's the phrase. He says, if I'm a king, why haven't you come until now? And then in that context, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai explains that he was just able to get out, and he says, and then a messenger comes and says, the king is dead in Rome, Vespasian, you're the king, long live the king. But this phrase that he says to Vespasian, And Vespasian responds, if I'm the king, why didn't you come till now? So, if I'm the king, why didn't you come to now? This page is one of the only pages that we're allowed to study on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is 3 weeks away from Rosh Chodesh Elul and 40 days away from Yom Kippur, 30 days away from Rosh Hashanah. This phrase, the Hasidim read this phrase as in the following story. The story is told that a person got up on Rosh Hashanah morning and he started to say Hamelech. That's the word that he starts the prayers with, where he calls out to God as the king. And the Chazam fainted. And then when they revived him, he said he saw this image before his eyes. God saying, if I'm the king, why haven't you come until now? That this is not read about Vespasian. We should read this phrase in the Talmud about God. That all of a sudden, Rosh Hashanah, we're calling out to God. We're saying, God, you're the king. So God responds, if I'm the king, why haven't you come until now? Iana Malka. Why haven't you come until now? And that's what we're going to be studying. This is the only thing we're allowed to study on Tisha B'Av. To tell us this, God is the king. Don't wait till Rosh Hashanah to declare God the king. On Tisha B'Av, that's what we're reminding ourselves, that this is the way we read this phrase. If I'm the king, why haven't you come until now? So that's a little bit of the context of the period of time that we're in. In that context, I wanted to read the parsha and also some of the stories of this page of the Daf Yomi. Let me just pause for a second if anybody has any questions. Anybody have any questions at this time? So, to go for a moment to the Rashi, the first Rashi of, really when you have a double portion, you're supposed to do Matos the first week and Massey the second week. But I wanted to start with Massey because I think it fits better with the period of the 3 weeks that we're discussing. And the passage of Massey begins with the journeys that the children of Israel went from the land, as they traveled through the wilderness. And there were 42 stops along the road, 42 journeys. It says in chapter 33, verse 1, these are the journeys that the children of Israel went from the land of Egypt with their legions, Biad Moshe and Aaron, in the hands of Moses and Aaron. Moshe wrote their journeys, which they journeyed according to God's command. And these are their journeys. And then the Torah goes and lists there are 42 journeys. Vayisumi Ramses, they travel from Ramses. And it goes through all 42 journeys. They're all listed here. It's a very, if we just stop for a moment, if we read the list, our eyes can get glassy. Why are we reading all these 42 names, places, like somebody else showing you pictures from their vacation? You're interested at first, but after a while, it gets, like, give me your top 3. I don't need to see all 42. But here we're going and we're seeing 42 journeys, 42 trips. So Rashi says the following. Rashi says, why are these 42 journeys written? Rashi is going to give 2 explanations. First explanation is to tell us the tremendous acts of kindness of God. So, even though God decreed upon Israel. By the way, let's just stop for a moment. Before we go into what Rashi is going to say, if those of us who are over 40 who are on this trip, who are on this Torah study session, If you have to write down the 42 journeys that you took over the last 40 years, what would make your list? That would be a spiritual exercise that you could do. Your 42 journeys. Because we've all had 42 journeys, probably more than that. But you have to, so anyway, going back to this text. Why did they write all these journeys? Tell us God's kindness. Even though after the sin of the spies, there was a decree, they have to wander through the wilderness. Don't say that they were wandering and moving about from one journey to the next, for the entire 40 years. Don't think that that's what happened. Don't think that they were wandering around every day and they were like homeless people who didn't have a place to go. There's only 42 journeys here. They only camped 42 times. Most of us go on more than 42 vacations. Then subtract 14, which were in the first year. Kodim Gezerah, and that was before they were decreed by the spies that they had to wander. And this total of the 14 includes the Ramses journey, but it does not include Ritma. And that's where they sent out the spies. As it says, send for yourselves spies. So therefore, we have right away, after the first year, we're down to 30. We're down to 28 journeys over the next 39 years. 28 journeys in 39 years, but we're not done. We know that after Aaron died, they immediately jumped back 8 journeys. They went back 8 stops. So after Aaron died in year 40, they have another 8. So therefore, that's 14 plus 8 is 22. So that means they have 18 journeys in 40 years. So therefore, Nimtza Shekol Shmona Shloshim Shana, that the 38 years in between year 1 and year 40, Lo Nasu Ela Esrim Masaot. They only had 20 journeys, meaning the 42, we subtract 22. So over 38 years, they had 20 encampments, which is not, they didn't have permanent homes, but they were really only traveling, changing their camp, not as often as we thought. So that's the first explanation that Rashi offers. The second explanation Rashi offers, Rabbi Tanchuma Darshbo Drasha Acharis. Rabbi Tanchuma says it's a different drasha. It's not to tell us, it's not to show us the kindness of God, that they had very few stops along the road, but rather it's Mashal Melech. It's a parable to a king, Shaya beno Chola, that his son was sick. He took his son and he traveled with him to a faraway place to heal him. When they returned, the father began to count all of the journeys. And he said to his son, here we slept, because they want to relive the memory of their salvation. Here we felt cold. Here we had a headache. Meaning to son, at the end of their difficult journey to get healed, the father or the king reminds his son everything they've gone to, because he's reminding his son how much he loves him. And so too Hashem is reminding the Jewish people of the 40 years in the wilderness to remind them of his love for them. Meaning to say, here we slept, that reminds us of when Israel was at peace. Here we were cold, that reminds us of the time that the Jewish people complained, or they felt they were missing something, or you had a headache, they were in danger. But the point is that there are 2 reasons, Rashi says, why we have to recount the 42 journeys. One, to show us that it wasn't as bad as we thought. That was really an act of kindness from God. And number 2 is to show us how much Hashem loved us. Those are the classic answers that Rashi gives. But I was very moved by something I saw that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote in the name of the Baal Shem Tov. And I just thought that was maybe an even more important spiritual lesson for us this this year. The Rebbe writes, the 42 journeys correspond, that the Baal Shem Tov teaches, that the 42 journeys correspond to the 42 spiritual journeys that we make throughout our life. If we choose good over evil, we'll indeed live through these phases of life in the way God intends. But if we make some wrong choices, we'll experience them as temporary step backs. So basically, these are the 42 spiritual journeys that each of us go through in life. And that's, to my mind, the powerful message of what is occurring here, that we're reminding ourselves, especially during this period of the 3 weeks, that we have had journeys, many, many journeys. And during the time of this national mourning, we're supposed to look back on our communal journeys and also our individual journeys, and to see how we've grown, and to see whether we're using our journeys as a way of growth or as a way of setting us back on our ultimate path, our spiritual path. So that's really what we should be taking this opportunity. That's why it's so important to us. I can't speak for other faiths, but for the Jewish faith, it's really so important that we're always looking backwards. We're looking forwards, but we're also always looking backwards. We're always looking back at the setbacks we've had in life, the mistakes, the journeys we've had, in order to help us move forward. And that's why during these 3 weeks, we're supposed to be looking back at what's caused the destruction of the temple. Those were the journeys we went on, so that we can figure out how the next 42 journeys in our life are better, that we're working on ourselves to achieve better journeys. So just before I move on, I just want to pause for a moment, see if anybody has any comments on that, questions or comments. Okay, so since once we mentioned these 42 journeys, I wanted to take a moment and journey back with everybody, because we have the rare occasion of the Daf Yomi. Really, the page for this Daf Yomi appears only once every 7.5 years, and it's telling us the story of the destruction of the temple. And normally, when we go through this story in the Daf Yomi, we go through it very quickly. So I figure we spend a little extra time telling this story, because even if you don't do the page of the Talmud every day, we should be reviewing this story in advance of Tisha B'Av in the middle of the 3 weeks. And the story is worthy of tremendous thought. So the Talmud tells us that Jerusalem was destroyed because of the temple was destroyed because of Kamsa or Bar Kamsa. Because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, Jerusalem was destroyed. What happened? So the Talmud tells us that there was a person in Jerusalem whose name was Kamsa. And this man Kamsa had a friend, and the friend wanted to invite him to the wedding or a party, a seuda, a meal. But he also had an enemy, somebody who hated, whose name was Bar Kamsa. And he sent a messenger to invite Kamsa, but in the end, the messenger went and brought Bar Kamsa. Now Rashi says that these were two separate people. They weren't connected at all. However, Marsha, the 15th century commentary, says that since Kamsa means Bar and the Talmud means son of, that Bar Kamsa was the son of Kamsa. And that's why the agent mixed it up. Bar Kamsa thought, well, since he's friends with my father, he must want to make peace. He must want to make peace with me. So this also explains in my mind why Kamsa is blamed for the destruction. What did Kamsa do wrong? Bar Kamsa, he wasn't even at the wedding. This tragedy that's going to unfold. Kamsa wasn't even there. Well, why would he agree to be invited to a wedding, or why would he be friends with this man who hates his son? But anyway, going back to the story, so the agent went to get Bar Kamsa, but instead he brought Bar Kamsa to the wedding. The whole debate amongst the commentaries whether Kamsa was also at the wedding. The text doesn't say that, but some imagine that he was there because Jerusalem was almost like a wedding where everybody could go. You didn't really need an invitation. So when this person sees him, he says, "Oh, I hate this man. What's he doing here?" He says, "Get out of here." He says, "Kum, poke." He says, "Get out of here." So Bar Kamsa didn't want to be embarrassed. And he said, "Since I've already showed up, abandon me here. Let me stay here. And I'll pay for my food and my drink. I'll pay for my food and my drink." So the Baal Habayis says, the person who's throwing the party says, "No, I'm not going to allow you to do that." So I'm not going to allow you to do that. So he says to him, "I'll pay for half your party." He says, "No." He says, "I'll pay for your whole party." He said, "No." He picked him up and he threw him out. He picked him up and he threw him out. And then he said, "Well," Bar Kamsa said, "Since all these rabbis were sitting here and nobody objected, I see from here that they agree with them, that they agree with this." This is a concept called silence is like acceptance. He said, all these rabbis were here at the party. Nobody objects. It must be that they agree with this decision-making process. So, first of all, we have a question. Why didn't the rabbis object? How come these rabbis didn't raise a voice? How come they didn't raise a voice? Now, you could just say, well, because they were problematic also. But the commentaries on the Talmud don't really want to take that approach because the commentaries on the Talmud assume that the rabbis were all tzaddikim. So it's possible that but the Maharsha says it straight out. He says, in that generation, and this is one of the causes for the destruction of the temple, the leaders were people who flattered wicked people. They wanted to, they didn't want to offend the wicked people. And so therefore, as a consequence, because they didn't want to offend the wicked people, they didn't object. Another explanation is that they gave the benefit of the doubt. They said, well, let's give the benefit of the doubt. Then maybe this person's they assume Bar Kamsa, maybe it was a child molester or a predator. They thought all these terrible things about him because they wanted to give this person the benefit of the doubt. Why should we assume he's wrong? Because, they assume that this is a guy they know. He probably has a good reason. And so for this reason, they didn't object. There's a lot of other explanations. There's a lot of other explanations for it, but those are the two main explanations about why the rabbis didn't object at that point. Why they didn't object at that point. So a couple of other explanations. The Ben Yehoyada says that maybe the sages didn't see that they actually kicked him out. Bar Kamsa thought that they saw, but they didn't know what was really going on. So the Ben Yehoyada, he basically assumed that the rabbis didn't make this mistake. Now, just finally, the Ksav Sofer says is because they knew that if they would have objected, they would have just made it worse. They knew that the owner of the party had himself a short fuse and he couldn't handle it. So then what were they doing there in the first place? Why didn't they leave? And anyway, we've all been there. We've all been to a situation where somebody was being treated improperly, and I'm sure all of us have not necessarily raised our voice in an effective manner to support the person who is being wronged. So back to the story, Bar Kamsa then says, it's become clear to me that the rabbis support this. So I'm going to go and I'm going to get them in trouble. Meaning to say, I'm going to say bad things about them to the king. He went to the Caesar and he says, the Jews are rebelling against you. So the Caesar says, who told you this? He said, send them a sacrifice and you'll see if they bring the sacrifice. So the Caesar sent a igla tilta. Igla tilta, well, the word tilta means three and igla is a calf. So the Talmud, this is a expression throughout the Talmud that means the choicest calf. He sent them his best animal. It could have either been a calf that was a third grown, like a veal, or else it could have been the third born of this animal, or just a fully grown calf that was especially good. But he sent the best animal. But before the animal got there, Bar Kamsa made a blemish in the lips, beniv sfatayim, that's the upper lip, or some say in the cataract of the eye. He made a blemish in the lip and the eye. And the Talmud says this is a place that for them is a blemish, but for us it's not a blemish. For us it's a blemish, but for them it's not a blemish. Why specifically in the lips and the eye? And why specifically is the Talmud saying that for us it's a blemish, so for them it's not a blemish? I think every single line in this story we can study for years and years and years. But first of all, it's an indication that our sin ultimately that caused the destruction of the temple has to do with two things, our lips and our eyes. That maybe either, you can imagine a sin with the eyes, either we're lusting, we're coveting, we're spending our time looking at the wrong things. And with our lips, maybe we're speaking improperly about other people, we're speaking in a vulgar manner, we're speaking in a way that's not spiritual. So we're using our eyes and our lips in our ways that are not spiritual. And so you might say, well, why are we being judged more harshly than the rest of the world? And that's what the Talmud says. This is something, it's a place that for them is not a blemish, but for us it's a blemish. We, the Jewish people, are more sensitive. We have more exposure because of what we believe is our special relationship with God. And so therefore for us, this will be a blemish, even though for the Jewish people, it's not a blemish, even though for the rest of the world, it's not a blemish. So now the rabbis see that they're not able to bring this sacrifice because it has a blemish on it. But if they mention this out loud, they didn't know what to do. So the rabbis said, maybe we'll bring it Mishum Shlom Malchus. Let's bring this sacrifice because we sometimes have to break the law or bend the law in order to make peace with the king. Why didn't they just send the message back to Vespasian and say, listen, king, we'd love to do it for you, but it violates our traditions, violates our law. So the answer to that is that what Bar Kamsa was trying to show is that the Jews think that they're different than you. They think that they're better, they think they're separate from you. They're not part of your orbit. So therefore, this would have been exactly what Bar Kamsa wanted. And the Jews were afraid to say we're any different than any of your other citizens, that we are holier for that reason. So they didn't want to say it. So they said, let's bring this temple anyway. So let's bring it anyway. So Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkula said, if they do that, then people will say we could bring an animal with a blemish on it on the altar. We'll come back to that. So then they said, okay, we're going to kill him. So that let's kill Bar Kamsa so he doesn't go back and tell the emperor what we did. So Rabbi Zechariah said, Rabbi Zechariah spoke up them and he said, you can't do that either because people will say that if you have a blemish on a sacred food, on a sacred animal, that's worthy of death. So you can't do that because people say, oh, if you try to bring an animal to blemish, you're going to get put to death. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan said, "An vatnuto shel Rabbi Zechariah ben Akkus hechrivat beitenu v'sarfa techolenu v'glitenu me'artzenu." So Rabbi Yochanan said, the humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Akkus destroyed our house, burnt our temple, and exiled us from the land. A couple of points about this. Very, very powerful line. First of all, of course, if they're going to kill him, the king is going to know. What do you think they're going to get away with it? So the commentaries say, no, they were going to kill him using the name of God, that they weren't going to actually physically harm him. They were going to wait for him to go out and rejoin the Romans, and then they were going to pronounce the name of God upon him, and then he would die. So they thought they could get away with it. So what does it mean, the humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Akkus? On a very basic level, the way usually humility is a positive quality. Moses is said to be the most humble man on the face of the earth. And yet here, humility is considered to be something that destroyed the temple. In what way was he humble? He didn't feel the strength to be able to give a ruling of vision. He was looking at the trees and he missed the forest. And we've all been there in a room with some people who have been unable to get the big picture. And this is what the Jewish, I think they're telling the story because that's the danger of what religion can do. Now, religion can sometimes cause us to lose the big picture and get absorbed in the minutia in a damaging manner. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan was saying. That Rabbi Zechariah ben Akkus is humility. He wasn't ready to see, he felt, I don't have enough to see the vision. I don't have enough to make radical change for the sake of saving our faith. He didn't feel that strength. He said, we're going to lose it all. And that caused our temple to be destroyed. So it's not just the humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Akkus in this specific area, but it's also the fact that nobody felt the empowerment to be able to correct the religion when it was going off course. Everybody was too humble. And they said, who are we to make a change? Who are we to try to make a repair? In this chapter, this story, it comes within the chapter of the Talmud that's called Tikkun Olam, which talks about all the changes and the reforms that the rabbis felt necessary to make. And they said, you could have done this. You had the ability to make this change. You could have done this. You have all the tools. The rabbis are saying we're living in a system which gives us the tools to make this change. And yet you didn't do it. You didn't think that you were big enough or great enough to be able to make this ruling. And that's what caused the destruction of the temple. A second approach is to the humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Akkus comes from the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon says that there's a ruling, there's a practice that the custom was that who would speak first whenever the court gathered to hear a case, the person who was the least distinguished amongst the group would speak first, because if the most distinguished spoke first, who's going to argue with him? Nobody's going to be so brazen as to argue with the Gadol Ador, with the greatest rabbi of the generation. So who's going to speak first? The least distinguished of the group, and then everybody will feel comfortable to argue against him. But in this case, Rabbi Zechariah ben Akkus was really the most distinguished member of the group. But he said, I'm the least distinguished. I'm going to speak first. So he spoke first, and then nobody was willing to argue with him because they said he was really the greatest. Otherwise, people could have pointed out all the things that were going to go wrong. And so therefore, that's the reason why Rabbi Zechariah ben Akkus they said the humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Akkus caused the destruction of our temple and exiled us. So the Maratz Chaya says, for sure, Maratz Chaya is the 19th century. The 19th century, he was from Lviv. There was a terrible attack in Lviv last week. And he says that the excessive humility caused a destruction. He gives a different explanation. Because technically speaking, you're allowed to bring a sacrifice that has a blemish on it if as a result of this, the whole Jewish people are going to be in danger. And also, you could also have killed Bar Kamsa if he was a mortal threat to all of the people. So of course you couldn't do it. We have a concept, somebody's trying to kill you, you're allowed to rise up and kill him. But rather, he didn't want to give this ruling of Horah Shah, of extenuating circumstances. And so that's the answer that the Maratz Chayes gives. A different explanation is that the Maratz Chayes, Gerash Yerachim says that Reb Zachariah ben Avkula says, who am I to give such a ruling? He didn't see it within himself that he had the strength or the courage to give such a ruling. That is one of the biggest failures of the rabbinic leadership, is what he's saying, is that none of them felt that they had the shoulders to give such a ruling. Another explanation is that Zechariah ben Avkulis thought that it would be attributed to him directly. And he said, what's going to happen is, he said, I'm going to be the one. He thought what would happen is that he would go back, that Bar Kamsa would go back to the king, and he'd say, it's all Zechariah ben Avkulis' fault. And then Zechariah ben Avkulis would be the one who would get the punishment for everybody. Meaning to say, my own blood is not worth anything. He thought his own blood I'd be willing to take one for the team. It's enough for me to be the one to die. And so that's what he was saying, that I'm not worth anything. And so therefore, Rabbi Yochanan said, because he was so humble and he thought that, he miscalculated. He didn't realize that that he's going to go back to the king and blame all of the people, not just Zechariah ben Avkulis. So those were some of the explanations so far. If anybody has any comments, let me just pause for a second. I've been speaking a while. We'll just try to give a couple of other explanations, if we have time. Why is this considered the humility of Zechariah ben Avkulis? The Ben Yoyada is, I think is also known as the Ben Ish Chai, that he says as follows. He says that Zechariah ben Avkulis was a Kohen, and he was standing in the temple with his brothers who are Kohanim. And the Kohanim, they wanted to bring the Korban because of this will make peace. Otherwise, we're going to have a fight. So Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkula said, you can't just do it on the basis of your opinion, because other people are going to come and say, oh, you could bring an animal with a blemish. He says, we need to get everybody's opinion. We can't do this until we get everybody to sign off. He wasn't saying you can't do it. He was just saying, okay, let's get everybody on board. You ever try to do something and say, okay, let's get more people on board? You know what happens? Impossible. But that's what he said. He said, let's get more people on board. And because we'll get to Sanhedrin and they'll allow it. And so therefore, they said to Bar Kamsa that he should go and ask the Sanhedrin if we could bring this animal. But what did Bar Kamsa do? He left and he immediately went back to the king, and he said that the Kohanim don't want to bring it. And so then they took the calf and they went back. And even though that the Kohanim said we should bring it, he didn't listen to them, because at first they didn't intend to bring it. Meaning, see, Zechariah ben Avkulis didn't say straight out, we can't bring it. He said, let's not make this decision ourselves. That's basically was his mistake. He said, let's just try and bring it to some, to the larger court. And that's the big problem. The big problem was they were afraid to think that they can make this decision on their own. well, just do one more explanation. There's so many explanations about why this was the humility of Zechariah ben Avkulas. The Sefer Rosh Dor, this is right, excuse me, the Sefer Rosh David of the Chidah, he explains that the reason why Zechariah ben Avkulas prohibited them to bring this small blemish, because this is just a very small blemish in the lip, was because it says in the Torah, Kol mum will yebo. There can't be any blemish. And he says, even any blemish whatsoever cannot be on it. Meaning to say, he said, anything is going to be considered to be like abomination. Meaning to say, he said, we need to have perfection. Meaning to say, anything that's not perfect can't be done. We all know people like that who are incapacitated because they're searching for perfection. And that's the problem. When you search for perfection, you get nothing done. And so therefore, this was the mistake that Zechariah ben Avkulas made. He said he wouldn't even be able to overlook a small blemish in the animal. Until we have perfection, we can't move forward. That was his tremendous mistake. And so that was why they said the humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas. He kept saying, we're not perfect, we're not good enough yet, we're not good enough yet. And that's what caused the destruction of the temple. So there's a lot of powerful lessons in the quote unquote humility of Zechariah ben Avkulas, of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas. In the end, it caused the destruction of the temple, caused the destruction of this spiritual center for the Jewish people. So in our own lives, we should, when we try to build spiritual centers, we should take into account this and not try to be either perfect, afraid to make mistakes, afraid of setting precedents, to move forward in a way and recognizing the mistake of Zechariah ben Avkulas. And we'll stop the recording. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address.